The quickest way to discover who people really are is to let them believe you have nothing they need. That thought crossed my mind exactly 3 seconds before my wife smiled into the microphone and erased 15 years of marriage with a single sentence. The ballroom glittered beneath crystal chandeliers that reflected across polished marble floors. Every table dressed in white linen and gold accents. Every conversation wrapped in expensive laughter. Caldwell Meridian Group spared no expense for its annual corporate gala. The city's most influential executives, investors, board members, and department heads filled the room in tailored tuxedos and designer gowns, raising champagne glasses beneath banners celebrating another record-breaking year. I adjusted the cuffs of my charcoal suit and stood near the back of the ballroom, exactly where Ashley preferred I stayed. My name is Daniel Whitman. I'm 44 years old, born and raised in Connecticut, and for most people in that room, I was simply Ashley Whitman's husband. Nothing more. Nobody asked what I did. Nobody cared. They had already accepted the version of me my wife quietly allowed them to believe. A pleasant man. Quiet. Forgettable. The husband fortunate enough to ride on the success of an ambitious executive climbing one corporate ladder after another. It hadn't always been that way. Years ago, Ashley used to introduce me with pride. She would reach for my hand before anyone else could. Somewhere between promotions, executive retreats, quarterly earnings, and endless networking dinners, that hand slowly disappeared. Eventually, I became an accessory, something that completed the picture without adding value to it. Funny how success can change the way people measure another person's worth. I wasn't angry anymore. Disappointed, maybe. But disappointment settles differently after enough years. It becomes quiet. It becomes patient. It learns to wait. A waiter passed carrying silver trays filled with champagne flutes. I declined with a polite smile and accepted a glass of sparkling water instead. My attention drifted toward the enormous company logo projected behind the stage. Caldwell Meridian Group. White letters against deep navy blue. Hundreds of employees looked at that logo with admiration. Some looked at it with ambition. A few looked at it with fear. I looked at it for an entirely different reason. Ashley stood near the center of the ballroom surrounded by senior directors, laughing effortlessly beside Mark Ellison, the vice president who never entered a room without announcing himself twice. His tailored tuxedo probably cost more than my first car, and he carried himself like someone convinced confidence and arrogance were the same thing. Every joke he told landed because everyone needed him to believe it had. Ashley noticed me from across the room and waved me over with 2 fingers, the same way someone might call for another drink. I walked toward the group, steady and relaxed. Conversations softened as I approached. Some smiled politely. Others barely acknowledged me. Mark looked me up and down before flashing that practiced corporate grin. "Daniel," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Glad you made it. We were just talking about impressive careers." A few people chuckled. Ashley smiled. Not the smile she used to say for me years ago. This one belonged to the audience around her. "Mark," she laughed, "be nice." He lifted both hands innocently. "I'm trying." The circle widened slightly, inviting more listeners. Corporate people love an audience almost as much as they love hierarchy. Ashley accepted a champagne flute from another server and gently tapped it with a dessert spoon. The tiny ringing sound spread farther than any raised voice ever could. Nearby conversations stopped. More faces turned toward her. She smiled with effortless confidence, shoulders back, chin slightly raised, completely at home beneath 100 watching eyes. "You all know how hard everyone here works," she began. "Every promotion, every bonus, every late night. It takes dedication." More nods. More smiles. "And sometimes," she continued, glancing toward me, "life reminds you that not everyone has the same drive." The laughter started softly. I remained still. Ashley tilted her head with playful amusement before delivering the sentence that would echo through that ballroom long after the music stopped. "My husband." She shrugged dramatically. "He's basically a nobody. I'm just lucky one of us had ambition." The room exploded with laughter. Some covered their mouths. Others leaned toward one another whispering. Mark laughed the loudest, nearly spilling his drink. Crystal glasses clinked together while polite applause mixed with amused smiles. I stood exactly where I was. I didn't lower my eyes. I didn't argue. I didn't force a smile. Instead, I looked past the crowd toward the enormous company logo glowing above the stage. Because unlike everyone else in that ballroom, I knew something they would all discover before the night was over. A strange thing happens when an entire room laughs at you. At first, the sound feels enormous, filling every corner of your mind. Then, almost without warning, it becomes distant, like waves breaking against a shoreline miles away. That was exactly how it felt standing beneath those chandeliers while Ashley accepted approving smiles from people who believed they had just witnessed an innocent joke. They thought I looked embarrassed. They were wrong. I was remembering. 15 years earlier, Ashley and I had celebrated our first anniversary with 2 cheeseburgers, 1 milkshake, and exactly $28 left in our checking account. She used to tell everyone I was the smartest man she had ever met. She believed character mattered more than titles. Success, she used to say, was something 2 people built together. Somewhere along the road, promotions replaced promises. Executive dinners replaced family evenings. Business cards became more valuable than conversations across our kitchen table. I never complained because love is not measured by who speaks louder. Sometimes it is measured by who remains patient the longest. Mark stepped closer, still grinning as if he had delivered the perfect punchline. He rested one hand lightly against my shoulder. "Come on, Daniel," he said. "Do not take it personally. We are all just having a little fun." Several executives nodded politely, relieved he had softened the moment. Ashley took another sip of champagne without looking at me. That hurt, more than the words. Not because she had embarrassed me, but because she honestly believed the room would always agree with her. I glanced around the ballroom. Waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying prime rib, lobster tails, and carefully plated desserts. A jazz quartet played softly near the stage while conversations slowly returned to quarterly profits, stock performance, and vacation homes. To everyone else, life had already moved on. For me, time had simply slowed down. My eyes settled once again on the illuminated company logo hanging behind the stage. Most people saw a successful corporation. I saw 18 months of confidential meetings, legal reviews, financial audits, and signatures that had changed everything without appearing in a single newspaper headline. Acquisitions rarely happen the way movies portray them. There are no dramatic countdowns. No reporters waiting outside. Just conference rooms with closed doors, lawyers reading every sentence twice, investment bankers discussing percentages that sound insignificant until they control billions of dollars. I had spent years building Whitman Holdings into something almost invisible. That was intentional. Visibility attracts attention. Quiet ownership creates freedom. Caldwell Meridian had struggled more than anyone inside the ballroom realized. Revenues looked impressive from the outside, but debt had quietly grown beneath the surface. Expansion came faster than cash flow. Several major investors wanted out. Others simply wanted someone capable of protecting what remained. That was when my advisors first placed the company on my desk. I spent months reviewing every contract, every liability, every opportunity. Not because I wanted another corporation, but because I believed the business deserved another chance. Ironically, Ashley never noticed any of it. She often joked that I spent too much time reading financial reports in my home office. She thought they were investment newsletters. I never corrected her. Some truths require silence until the right moment arrives. "Daniel." Ashley finally looked at me. "Why are you standing there? Smile a little." Her voice sounded gentle enough for nearby guests to admire her kindness. Only I recognized the impatience underneath it. People are watching. I smiled exactly as she requested. Calm, relaxed, respectful. That seemed to confuse her more than anger ever could have. Mark frowned slightly. Bullies often expect resistance. They rarely know what to do with composure. Across the ballroom, movement near the stage caught my attention. Richard Caldwell had arrived. Even at 68 years old, the founder and longtime chief executive officer carried himself with quiet confidence. Conversations naturally paused as he greeted board members one by one. Several photographers gathered nearby while assistants checked the microphones placed beside the podium. The formal presentation would begin in only a few minutes. Mark straightened his tuxedo jacket. Ashley adjusted the diamond earrings I had given her on our 10th anniversary. Around us, executives hurried toward the stage, eager to stand close enough for photographs that would appear on company social media before midnight. Nobody noticed Richard briefly looking across the ballroom. Our eyes met for less than 2 seconds. He offered the smallest nod imaginable before turning back toward the board of directors. No one else recognized it. They could not have understood what that quiet gesture meant. But I did. Everything was ready. The signatures were complete. The board had voted. The announcement waiting inside the leather folder resting beside the podium would change far more than the direction of one corporation. It would reveal exactly how little the people laughing tonight had ever understood about the quiet man standing among them. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as soft instrumental music faded into the background. Conversations settled into quiet anticipation while servers disappeared through side doors with empty trays balanced effortlessly above their shoulders. Every annual gala followed the same rhythm. Cocktails first, awards second, executive speeches next. Then came the announcement everyone expected to celebrate another profitable year. Nobody suspected tonight would become something entirely different. I remained near the edge of the crowd, watching people naturally organize themselves according to status. Senior executives occupied the front rows closest to the stage. Directors gathered just behind them. Department managers drifted toward the center. Everyone else filled whatever space remained. It fascinated me how quickly human beings arranged themselves into invisible hierarchies without anyone giving instructions. Ashley belonged exactly where she wanted to be, standing only a few feet from the podium beside Mark and several vice presidents. She laughed easily, greeting board members by name, accepting compliments on another successful quarter as though she had already secured the promotion everyone expected. More than once I heard someone congratulate her on having such a bright future inside Caldwell Meridian. She accepted every compliment with polished confidence. Not once did she glance back to see whether I had found a seat. That small detail hurt more than I wanted to admit. Neglect rarely arrives all at once. It comes quietly, one forgotten moment after another, until eventually you realize you stopped existing in someone else's priorities long before they stopped existing in yours. I thought back to the evening she received her first management promotion. We celebrated with takeout Italian food because neither of us wanted to spend money at a restaurant. Ashley cried when she opened the small fountain pen I had engraved with her initials. She promised she would sign every important document with it because she wanted to remember where her journey began. Years later, that same pen rested inside a drawer somewhere in our house, replaced by luxury brands handed out during executive conferences. Success had not changed her overnight. It simply convinced her that people without visible power eventually became invisible themselves. She never understood the difference between being unnoticed and being unimportant. There is a remarkable distance between those two things. My phone vibrated once inside my jacket pocket. I quietly slipped it out just enough to read the screen. One message. From Michael Benton, my lead counsel at Whitman Holdings. The closing documents have been archived. Board confirmation complete. Everything is official. I locked the screen without replying. There was nothing left to discuss. The transaction had ended hours earlier. Tonight was no longer about paperwork. Tonight belonged to truth. A familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. Daniel. I turned to find Richard Caldwell approaching slowly through the crowd. Several executives immediately stepped aside, assuming he wanted to greet Ashley. Instead, he extended his hand toward me with quiet respect. Before either of us could speak, one of his assistants hurried over and whispered something into his ear. Richard smiled apologetically. Duty calls, he said warmly. We will speak shortly. He gave my hand a firm shake before walking toward the stage entrance. The exchange lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Ashley saw it. So did Mark. Confusion crossed both of their faces. You know Mr. Caldwell? Mark asked with an amused grin that barely hid his curiosity. We have met a few times, I answered honestly. Ashley let out a quiet laugh. Daniel is being modest. Richard probably shakes thousands of hands every year. Mark nodded as though that explanation restored the natural order of the universe. Exactly, he replied. Successful people are good at remembering faces. I simply smiled. Sometimes the easiest way to protect an important truth is allowing people to invent a comfortable lie instead. The ballroom lights dimmed once more before bright spotlights illuminated the stage. Applause spread across the room as members of the board of directors took their seats behind a long polished table. Richard Caldwell walked confidently toward the podium carrying a dark leather portfolio beneath one arm. The applause grew louder. Ashley straightened her posture. Mark adjusted his tie. Phones appeared throughout the audience as guests prepared to record another routine corporate speech. They expected announcements about revenue growth, strategic expansion, and optimistic forecasts. They believed they already knew how the evening would end. I folded my hands calmly in front of me and watched Richard place the leather portfolio beside the microphone. He looked across the audience, slowly, almost thoughtfully, allowing the silence to settle before speaking. Then, for the briefest moment, his eyes found mine again. The same quiet understanding passed between us. No smile, no dramatic gesture, just certainty. The next words spoken from that stage would divide my life into two completely different chapters, and everyone who had laughed only minutes earlier was about to discover that the man they had dismissed had never been standing outside the story. He had been quietly holding the final page all along. Richard Caldwell rested both hands lightly on the podium and waited until the applause faded into complete silence. He had spent 4 decades building Caldwell Meridian into one of the largest engineering and infrastructure companies in the country, and people listened whenever he spoke. His voice was calm, measured, almost fatherly. Good evening, everyone. Tonight we celebrate another remarkable year, but before we recognize individual achievements, I would like to share a personal story. The room settled even further. Executives lowered their phones slightly, sensing this speech was different from previous years. Richard smiled faintly before continuing. Many of you know this company through financial reports, quarterly meetings, and annual targets. Very few know what the last 18 months have truly looked like behind closed doors. Ashley folded her hands neatly in front of her. Mark leaned toward another vice president and whispered something I could not hear. They still believed the evening belonged to them. Richard continued speaking. Every successful company eventually reaches a crossroads. Markets change. Opportunities evolve. Leadership must adapt. During the past year, our board carefully evaluated what would best secure the future of Caldwell Meridian for our employees, our clients, and our shareholders. Several board members nodded in quiet agreement. Around the ballroom, conversations had completely disappeared. Even the waitstaff paused near the walls. Richard was building towards something important, but no one yet understood where he intended to go. My breathing remained slow and steady. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind dozens of times during countless flights, legal meetings, and private conversations with advisors. Oddly enough, now that it had finally arrived, I felt almost peaceful. There is a strange freedom that comes from knowing the truth no longer belongs only to you. My thoughts drifted back to the first meeting 18 months earlier. Richard had invited me into a modest conference room overlooking the Connecticut River rather than the impressive executive boardroom everyone expected. He had poured 2 cups of black coffee himself before placing several thick financial binders across the table. Forget the headlines, he told me. Tell me what you actually see. For nearly 3 hours, we discussed debt structures, pension obligations, supply chain risks, long-term capital investment, and leadership succession. He never once tried to impress me. He wanted honesty, not admiration. When the meeting ended, he smiled and said, "Most people see numbers. You see consequences." That conversation became another, then another. Eventually, attorneys replaced analysts. Investment bankers replaced consultants. Quietly, patiently, piece by piece, the framework for a complete acquisition came together. Every decision happened inside conference rooms protected by confidentiality agreements. Every signature carried years of preparation behind it. The process never appeared in financial news because discretion had been one of my conditions from the beginning. I never wanted publicity. I wanted stability. Back in the ballroom, Richard opened the leather portfolio resting beside the microphone. The simple motion drew every pair of eyes toward the stage. Papers slid neatly onto the podium beneath the bright lights. Ashley smiled confidently towards several colleagues, as if expecting another routine corporate announcement about future expansion. Mark casually adjusted his cuff links, looking almost bored. Neither of them realized they were sitting inside the final minutes of the world they believed they understood. Richard looked across the audience again. Leadership, he said, is often misunderstood. Many believe it belongs to the loudest voice in the room or the most recognizable title on an office door. In my experience, true leadership usually belongs to the person willing to solve difficult problems without asking for applause. Those words settled over the ballroom like fresh snowfall. I noticed Ashley briefly glance toward me before quickly looking away again. Perhaps she simply recognized how different Richard's tone sounded tonight. Or perhaps something deeper had begun quietly whispering inside her instincts. People often sense change before they understand it. Richard turned one page inside the portfolio. Several months ago, after careful consideration, our board unanimously approved a transition that we believe will protect this company for generations to come. A ripple moved through the audience. Some executives exchanged uncertain looks. Others instinctively reached for their phones again. Ashley's confident expression softened into curiosity. Mark straightened in his chair for the first time all evening. No one laughed now. No one whispered. The atmosphere had changed completely. The ballroom no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like history waiting for permission to introduce itself. The silence inside the ballroom carried a different weight now. A few minutes earlier it had been filled with polite laughter and effortless confidence. Now it felt careful, almost cautious, as though every person in the room suddenly realized they might not know the entire story. Richard Caldwell closed the portfolio for a moment and rested one hand against its leather cover. "When I founded this company," he said, "I believed success meant building something that could outlive me. Over the years, I learned another lesson. A company does not survive because of buildings or stock prices. It survives because the right people are willing to protect it when difficult decisions arrive." No one moved. Hundreds of eyes remained fixed on the stage. Ashley folded her arms lightly across her waist, the confident smile from earlier now replaced by quiet concentration. Mark glanced towards several board members, searching for clues in their expressions. He found none. They had practiced discipline for months. Their faces revealed nothing. Richard continued. "About 18 months ago, we began evaluating every possible path forward. We considered private equity firms, institutional investors, strategic mergers, and international partnerships. Every proposal looked impressive on paper. Every presentation promised growth. Every spreadsheet projected opportunity." He paused just long enough for the words to settle. But every one of them asked the same question. "How much value can we extract from this company?" Only one person asked a completely different question. "How many families depend on protecting it?" A quiet murmur drifted across the audience before disappearing almost immediately. I remembered asking exactly that question during our second meeting. Financial models mattered. Cash flow mattered. Shareholder value mattered. But behind every balance sheet stood thousands of employees who simply wanted stability. Engineers, accountants, administrative assistants, technicians, receptionists, people with mortgages, college tuition, aging parents, and children waiting at home every evening. A corporation is never just numbers. It is thousands of ordinary lives connected by one decision after another. Richard had understood that immediately. That was why our conversations had lasted months instead of hours. Across the ballroom, Ashley slowly turned toward one of her colleagues. I noticed her lips move quietly, asking something I could not hear. The woman beside her simply shrugged. She did not know either. Mark loosened his collar almost instinctively before checking his phone beneath the table. No doubt he expected an email or news alert explaining where this speech was heading. Nothing appeared. Confidentiality agreements had done exactly what they were designed to do. Information had remained sealed until this moment. Richard opened the portfolio once more. The transition required extensive legal review, financial restructuring, regulatory approval, and unanimous support from our board of directors. Every requirement has now been completed. Another wave of whispers rolled gently through the ballroom before fading again. I noticed several investment analysts sitting near the rear. Exchanged puzzled expressions. They understood enough about corporate acquisitions to recognize the significance of Richard's words. This was no symbolic announcement. Ownership itself had changed. Ashley's posture stiffened slightly. For the first time that evening, she looked directly toward me instead of through me. Her eyes searched my face as though expecting some visible reaction. I offered none. My heartbeat remained steady. My breathing remained slow. The truth did not become more important simply because other people were about to learn it. It had been true all along. Richard carefully removed a single document from the portfolio. Even from where I stood, I recognized the signature page. We had reviewed that exact page together only 2 days earlier. He lifted it gently beneath the stage lights. Every signature on this document represents months of careful work performed with one objective: protecting the future of Caldwell Meridian for the next generation. The room had become so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning above the chandeliers. Somewhere near the back, a champagne glass touched another with a soft metallic sound before both quickly became still again. Richard smiled, not with excitement, but with quiet satisfaction. It was the smile of a man finally free to tell the truth after carrying it alone for far too long. Then he looked slowly across the audience, allowing his gaze to pass over executives, directors, shareholders, and finally toward the place where I stood. I recognized that look immediately. Months earlier, inside a private conference room overlooking the river, he had looked at me exactly the same way before extending his hand across the table. "When the time comes," he had said, "I want everyone to understand that this decision was never about buying a company. It was about trusting the right person to carry it forward." Standing beneath the ballroom lights, I realized that moment had finally arrived. Richard lowered the document onto the podium with deliberate care, almost as though he understood that every second of silence increased the weight of what came next. No music played anymore. Even the photographers, standing beside the stage, had stopped adjusting their cameras. They sensed that the next few moments would matter far more than another smiling executive accepting an award. Richard looked across the ballroom one final time before speaking again. "For months, many of you have asked who would eventually guide Caldwell Meridian into its next chapter. Some assumed the answer would come from inside this room. Others believed an international investment group would acquire the company. A few even expected a merger." He smiled gently. The truth turned out to be much simpler. Every eye remained fixed on him. Ashley slowly lowered her champagne glass onto the nearest cocktail table without taking another sip. Her confident posture had disappeared completely. Mark crossed his arms, forcing an expression of calm that did not quite reach his eyes. He was calculating possibilities now, mentally reviewing every executive rumor he had heard over the past year. None of them matched what Richard was describing. I remained exactly where I had been standing all evening. There was no reason to move. My place in the room had never depended on where I stood. It depended on decisions that had already been made. Richard rested both hands lightly against the podium. "Leadership is not always visible," he said. "Sometimes the most important work happens quietly, away from cameras, away from headlines, and away from recognition. The individual we selected never once asked for publicity. In fact, he requested the opposite." A soft murmur drifted through the audience. Several board members exchanged knowing smiles, but remained perfectly composed. They had lived with this secret for months. Tonight they were finally allowed to breathe normally again. Richard continued. He insisted that every employee be protected during the transition. He refused to approve unnecessary layoffs. He required long-term investment instead of short-term profit. He asked more questions about people than percentages. That told me everything I needed to know. My thoughts returned to one conversation inside Richard's office shortly after the acquisition agreement reached its final draft. He had asked whether I wanted my name announced immediately after closing. I declined without hesitation. The company needed stability before celebration. Employees deserved certainty before headlines. Wealth often teaches people how to accumulate more. Responsibility teaches something entirely different. It teaches restraint. Across the ballroom, Ashley looked toward me again. This time she did not quickly look away. Her expression had become thoughtful, almost uncertain, as though scattered memories had begun assembling themselves into a picture she had never considered before. I wondered whether she remembered the evenings I quietly excused myself after dinner to take confidential conference calls from my office. She always assumed I was managing personal investments. Technically, she had not been wrong. She had simply underestimated the scale. Mark leaned closer to Ashley and whispered something into her ear. She answered with the smallest shake of her head. Neither of them seemed comfortable anymore. Confidence often depends on believing you understand the room. Once that certainty disappears, even familiar surroundings begin to feel unfamiliar. Richard opened the leather portfolio once more and removed a single folded sheet. Unlike the legal documents beneath it, this page contained no financial language, no signatures, and no corporate terminology. It held only a prepared statement. He unfolded it carefully before looking directly into the audience. "There is one final part of this evening that gives me particular satisfaction," he said warmly. "After 40 years, I have the privilege of introducing the person I trust to carry this company beyond anything I could accomplish alone." The ballroom became perfectly still. I noticed one photographer slowly raise his camera toward the stage. Another positioned himself near the center aisle, anticipating someone important would soon walk forward. Several executives instinctively adjusted their jackets. A few even glanced around themselves, quietly wondering whether they might know the individual about to be recognized. Ashley's breathing appeared slightly quicker now. Mark no longer smiled at all. Richard lifted his eyes from the paper and allowed the silence to linger for one final heartbeat. Then he spoke into the microphone with calm certainty. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the new owner of Caldwell Meridian Group." He paused just long enough for anticipation to reach every corner of the ballroom before turning his head toward the back of the room. His eyes met mine, and a warm smile slowly crossed his face. "Mr. Daniel Whitman," he said clearly, "would you please come join me on the stage?" For one impossible second, the ballroom forgot how to breathe. Nobody clapped. Nobody whispered. The silence landed with enough weight to make the entire room feel smaller. I could hear the faint buzz of the stage lights overhead and the soft hum of the ventilation system somewhere beyond the chandeliers. Richard Caldwell remained standing beside the podium, his smile patient and unwavering, still looking directly at me. Around him, every member of the board sat perfectly composed. None of them appeared surprised because they had already lived with this truth for months. The surprise belonged to everyone else. Ashley turned toward me so quickly that one of her earrings caught the light like a flash of glass. Her expression emptied itself of certainty, replaced first by confusion, then disbelief. She looked at Richard, then back at me, as if waiting for someone to laugh and explain that the announcement had been misunderstood. Mark's confident posture disappeared completely. His arms slowly dropped to his sides while his mouth opened slightly, without producing a single word. I recognized that expression. It was the face people make when reality refuses to match the story they have been telling themselves. The photographer standing near the center aisle instinctively pointed his camera toward me, hesitated for half a second, then pressed the shutter. The bright flash cut across the ballroom. That single photograph would probably become tomorrow's company headline. Not because I wanted attention, but because history rarely asks permission before documenting itself. Richard spoke again, his voice warm and steady. "Daniel, please join me." I nodded once and began walking toward the stage. Every step echoed softly against the polished marble floor. It was remarkable how long a simple walk could feel when hundreds of people were watching. Earlier that evening I had crossed the same ballroom, almost unnoticed. Now every pair of eyes followed me. Conversations remained frozen in unfinished sentences. Champagne glasses stayed suspended halfway to smiling faces that no longer remembered how to smile. As I passed the executive tables, people instinctively stepped aside without anyone asking them to. Respect often arrives much faster than understanding. Ashley whispered my name. "Daniel." I stopped beside her table and looked at her calmly. She searched my face with desperate urgency, looking for the husband she believed she understood only an hour earlier. "Why? Why did you never tell me?" she asked quietly. There was no accusation left in her voice, only confusion. I held her gaze for a moment before answering honestly. "You never asked what I was building. You only asked what title I held." The words were not spoken with anger. They did not need to be. Some truths carry enough weight on their own. Ashley lowered her eyes. I could almost see memories replaying behind them. The evenings I spent inside my home office. The business trips I described only as investment meetings. The confidential calls I quietly excused myself to take after dinner. She had noticed every one of those moments. She had simply decided they were too ordinary to matter. Mark cleared his throat awkwardly. "Daniel, if I said anything inappropriate earlier." His sentence dissolved before reaching the end. I offered him the same polite smile I had worn all evening. "You said exactly what you believed. That was all. I did not need anything more." Apologies offered only after circumstances change rarely repair what character has already revealed. I continued toward the stage while the audience slowly parted. Several employees who had barely acknowledged me earlier now watched with expressions somewhere between admiration and disbelief. Others quietly replayed every conversation they had ever shared with me, wondering whether they had missed clues that suddenly seemed obvious in hindsight. The truth was they had missed nothing. I had never pretended to be anyone else. People simply accepted the version of me that required the least imagination. Reaching the stage, I climbed the short staircase without hurry. Richard extended his hand before the audience, and I accepted it firmly. The applause finally began. At first it came from a single table near the front. Then another joined. Within seconds the entire ballroom stood together, the sound filling every corner of the room beneath the crystal chandeliers. It was loud, genuine, and almost overwhelming. Yet standing beside Richard, listening to hundreds of people applaud, my thoughts did not drift toward ownership, wealth, or victory. They returned instead to one quiet sentence Ashley had spoken earlier that evening when she believed everyone important agreed with her. Funny how quickly a room can redefine the meaning of somebody once it discovers what was true all along. The applause continued for several long seconds before slowly fading into a respectful silence. I stood beside Richard Caldwell beneath the bright stage lights, looking across a sea of faces that had changed more in 1 minute than I had believed possible. Earlier that evening, many of those same people had smiled politely without really seeing me. Now they watched with careful attention, searching for clues about the man they had overlooked. Richard placed one hand lightly on my shoulder before stepping aside from the podium. "The floor is yours, Daniel," he said. I walked forward, adjusted the microphone only slightly, and looked across the ballroom. It would have been easy to enjoy the moment. It would have been easy to remind everyone how quickly opinions can change when money enters the conversation. But that was never why I accepted ownership of Caldwell Meridian. I cleared my throat and began quietly. "Thank you, Richard. And thank all of you for being here tonight." My voice carried naturally through the silent ballroom. "I know this announcement surprised many of you. That is understandable. Confidential agreements required complete discretion until every legal requirement had been satisfied." Several people nodded. Others remained perfectly still, listening. "I also understand that many of you have questions. Some of those questions concern me. Others concern your careers, your departments, your projects, and your families. If that is what you are thinking tonight, let me answer the most important one first." I paused briefly before continuing. "No one in this company needs to fear unnecessary change simply because ownership has changed." I noticed shoulders relax across the room. Relief appeared almost instantly on dozens of faces. Engineers, accountants, administrative assistants, department managers, and project leaders had all spent enough years in corporate America to know acquisitions often brought uncertainty. This company was not acquired to dismantle it. I continued. It was acquired because I believe it deserves to grow responsibly for decades to come. Experience matters. Loyalty matters. Integrity matters. Those qualities cannot be purchased on a balance sheet. A wave of genuine applause rolled through the ballroom before fading again. Richard smiled quietly from a few steps behind me. I continued speaking. "Over the coming months, every department will receive the support necessary to continue serving our clients with excellence. We will invest in innovation, strengthen long-term partnerships, and continue rewarding people who earn trust through consistent work." My eyes naturally drifted toward the audience, where Ashley still stood motionless beside her table. Her expression remained difficult to describe. Shock had softened into reflection. She was no longer looking at the owner of a corporation. She was looking at the husband she suddenly realized she had stopped trying to understand. Nearby, Mark avoided meeting my eyes altogether. His earlier confidence had completely disappeared. I felt no satisfaction watching either of them struggle with the moment. Victory built upon another person's humiliation rarely lasts. Character is revealed by what someone chooses to do after gaining power, not before. I rested both hands lightly against the podium. "Before I finish," I said, "there is one lesson I learned many years ago that has guided every business decision I have ever made." The room became perfectly still again. Titles can open doors. Wealth can create opportunities. But neither one tells you how to treat another human being. Respect should never depend on a person's job title, salary, office location, or perceived influence. The quietest individual in the room may be carrying responsibilities you cannot imagine. The person standing beside you may know more than they choose to say. That is why I have always believed respect should be given before it is proven profitable. No one applauded immediately. They simply listened. Sometimes silence is the strongest form of agreement. Finally, applause rose once again, slower this time, warmer, more sincere than before. It did not sound like celebration alone. It sounded like understanding. As I stepped back from the microphone, Richard extended his hand once more, and we shook hands before the board of directors. Camera flashes filled the ballroom again, capturing photographs that would appear in newspapers, company newsletters, and business journals by morning. Yet standing beneath those lights, surrounded by applause and recognition, I realized the most valuable thing I had gained that evening was not ownership of a corporation. It was the certainty that I no longer needed anyone else's opinion to define my worth. The formal presentation ended, but very few people returned to their conversations. The ballroom had transformed into something entirely different from the celebration that had begun earlier that evening. Executives who normally moved with polished confidence now stood quietly in small circles, carefully choosing every word. The atmosphere no longer revolved around quarterly profits or networking opportunities. It revolved around perspective. Amazing how quickly perspective changes when assumptions disappear. Richard Caldwell remained on stage speaking with several board members, while photographers captured the final official portraits. I stepped down from the platform and slowly made my way through the ballroom. This time people greeted me differently. Department managers introduced themselves with genuine warmth instead of polite obligation. Engineers thanked me for speaking about long-term stability. Administrative assistants smiled with visible relief after hearing that no unnecessary layoffs were planned. Their reactions reminded me why I had agreed to acquire Caldwell Meridian in the first place. Businesses succeed because ordinary people show up every morning, solve problems, and keep promises. They deserved leadership that remembered that truth. As I approached the ballroom entrance, I heard quiet footsteps behind me. Daniel. Ashley's voice barely rose above the soft music that had started playing again. I turned and found her standing several feet away, holding the champagne glass she had never finished. Her eyes looked tired, not from the evening itself, but from everything she had begun remembering. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked down at the floor before meeting my eyes again. I do not know what to say. Her voice was honest now. Gone was the polished confidence she carried around executives. Gone was the rehearsed smile that belonged to corporate receptions. Standing before me was simply the woman I had married years ago, carrying the weight of choices she could no longer explain away. I answered quietly, "You do not have to explain tonight." She nodded slowly. I kept thinking success meant standing beside the most important people in the room. A sad smile crossed my face. The important people were never difficult to find. They were the ones who treated everyone with respect before they knew who they were. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. I stopped seeing you. There was no anger inside me anymore. Only clarity. No, I replied gently. You stopped trying to. The difference mattered. We stood together in silence while guests continued leaving the ballroom behind us. Across the room, I noticed Mark speaking quietly with several colleagues. Earlier, he had been the loudest voice in the room. Now he listened far more than he spoke. Perhaps tonight had taught him something as well. I hoped it had. Humility learned early is always less expensive than humility learned late. Ashley looked toward the stage one final time before speaking again. Can we talk tomorrow? I considered the question carefully. 15 years of marriage deserved honesty, not impulsive decisions made in the middle of an emotional evening. Tomorrow, I answered. Not because everything is suddenly fixed. Because important conversations deserve calm minds. Relief softened her expression, though uncertainty remained. She understood that forgiveness and trust were not the same thing. Some bridges can be repaired. Others must be rebuilt one careful step at a time. Richard approached with his usual calm smile and shook my hand once more. Ready for your first day? He asked with quiet humor. I smiled. I have been preparing for 18 months. He laughed softly. That is exactly why I knew the company would be in good hands. Outside, the cool evening air carried the familiar scent of rain drifting in from the river. The city lights reflected across the wet streets while the last guests departed beneath rows of elegant lamps. I paused for a moment before walking toward my car. Wealth had never changed who I was because it had never been the measure I used to value myself. Ownership had not made me somebody tonight. It had simply revealed what had always been true. Real character is built quietly, long before anyone applauds. Real respect is offered before it becomes convenient. And the strongest people rarely need to announce their worth because time has a remarkable way of introducing them when the moment is right. As I drove away from the ballroom, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The building slowly disappeared behind the curve of the road, but one lesson remained perfectly clear. Never mistake a quiet person for an unimportant one. Some of the strongest foundations are hidden beneath the surface, supporting everything above them without ever asking to be seen.